This video was brought to you by the TLDR socials. Get more from TLDR by following us on Instagram and Twitter, where we post explainers that never make it to YouTube. The link's below. It's common for representatives in national parliaments to organise themselves into parties, or groups that have common ideological beliefs. This way, it's easier for them to decide how to vote as a group based on their ideological commonalities. Since the inception of the EU, though, representatives have had to come up with a way of organising themselves not only in national legislatures, but in supranational organisations such as the EU. One option would be for the representatives to stay in their national parties. The difficulty here, though, would be that there would be more than 150 political parties. So parties decide to organise themselves into political groups, which group together national parties with similar ideological beliefs in the EU. For example, there were a bunch of different Green parties across the continent. In the EU Parliament, they joined forces to create the Greens European Free Alliance. This is the same for all sorts of different parties, from Conservatives to Liberals to Eurosceptics. Before we go through the current groupings and explain who's part of them, let's discuss what these groupings actually do. Obviously, being in a grouping assists from just a logical perspective, helping them to organise together on key votes in the European Parliament. Additionally though, being in a political grouping means that the members are guaranteed seats in parliamentary committees as well as getting financial subsidies. As good as the parliamentary groupings are, there are some barriers to entry that are designed to stop small and potentially extreme parties from gaining the benefits of political groupings. Initially, the rule stated that each political grouping had to have at least 20 MEPs. Back in 2007, a group of far-right parties, such as the French National Front and the Austrian Freedom Party, attempted to create their own political grouping, called the Identity, Tradition and Sovereignty Group, or ITS. They scraped together 23 MEPs, meeting the requirements, and thus were granted more than €1 million in funding from the EU and guaranteed seats on certain EU committees. As you can imagine, there was quite a controversy at the time about the fact that the EU themselves were funding far-right parties. Unfortunately for them though, on the 8th of November 2007, 5 of its main members were caught in a scandal related to comments about Romanian criminals being expelled from Italy, made by Alessandra Mussolini, a member of ITS. And, before anyone in the comments says they recognise her surname from somewhere, yes, you're right, she shares her name with the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. And yes, she is his granddaughter. Her comments caused the 5 Romanian members of ITS to effectively quit, meaning that the political grouping dropped below the 20 required members. By the end of 2007 then, before the political groupings had been around for even a year, it had to be shut down for failing to meet the requirements. Following the collapse of ITS then, the EU decided it was a good idea to tighten its rules about who can form political groupings. The minimum number of MEPs was increased from 20 to 25 MEPs, and a requirement was introduced that meant that at least 25% of the countries in the EU must be represented by the new political grouping. These days, there are only 7 political groupings in the European Parliament. We'll have a look at these one by one, starting with the largest. The biggest political grouping by far is the European People's Party grouping. They currently have 175 MEPs in the European Parliament, or roughly 25%. This grouping is centre-right and generally conservative. They stand against taxation, against socially liberal policies, and against Turkish accession to the EU. The largest parties that make up this grouping are the German Christian Democratic Union, the Spanish People's Party, and the Polish Civil Platform. The second largest is the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, who, as the name suggests, are left-leaning, or more specifically centre-left. They stand for things generally associated with this ideology, such as social justice. They currently have 145 MEPs in Parliament, which obviously puts them behind the EPP, but not by much. The largest parties that make up this grouping are the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, or PSOE, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, or the SDP, and the Democratic Party of Italy, or the PD. Moving down the list again, and we get to the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. Well, sort of. Their name gives away their political ideology, with them subscribing to a centrist liberal position. Interestingly here though, the group has recently collapsed and created a new grouping called Renew Europe, effectively the successor to the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats. In effect, the group wanted to be able to align itself with the French party En Marche, most famous for being the party founded by French President Emmanuel Macron. Like En Marche, they wanted to avoid being called Liberals, but unfortunately for them, they're still referred to as Liberals due to their previous name. The Renew group currently has 97 MEPs in the EU Parliament, and before the switch from the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe, they were headed by Guy Verhofstadt. He is, though, no longer the chairman. The largest parties that make up this grouping are En Marche, the Romanian USR Plus, and the Spanish Citizens. Going into the first of the de facto opposition parties, we get to the European Conservatives and Reformists. This is the first political grouping in the list that actually, broadly, stands for a Eurosceptic ideology. As such, it stands against the expansion of the EU and advocates for stricter controls on immigration and a free market. Currently, the group has 74 MEPs in the Parliament, and the largest parties contained within it are the Law and Justice Party of Poland, the Brothers of Italy, and the Czech Civil Democratic Party. Next is another right-wing grouping known as the Identity and Democracy Group. It is, arguably, a group that is more right-wing than the European Conservatives and Reformists, and it contains parties that can be described as nationalist and right-wing populists. Currently, they also command 74 MEPs in the Parliament, the same as the European Conservatives and Reformists, with their top parties being League from Italy, National Rally from France, and the Alternative for Germany. Unsurprisingly, from Germany. Jumping to the other side of the political spectrum, we find the Green European Free Alliance. There isn't a huge amount to say here, as we all know what Green parties typically stand for: environmentalism, social justice, etc. The Greens have 73 MEPs, putting them only one MEP behind the previous two groupings. Before we go on to list the largest parties that make up the grouping, it is also interesting to point out that the Czech Pirate Party and Volt Europa, two parties we've made videos on recently, are members of this grouping. Despite not officially being Green parties, they stand for very similar principles, and therefore likely feel most at home in this grouping. Anyway, the largest parties in this grouping are the German Greens, the French Greens, and the Austrian Greens. And finally, to the last political grouping. We have the Left in the European Parliament. Yes, that is the name. As you've probably already noticed as we've gone through this list, there are already a lot of left-leaning groupings. So why, you could reasonably ask, is there yet another? Well, this grouping is different because it's a lot further left than many of the other groupings. The grouping stands for a withdrawal from NATO and is against the EU's political structure. It also contains groups which have been described as both socialist and even communist. This grouping is the smallest, with only 39 MEPs, including La France Insoumise, the Greek Syriza, and the German The Left. So that's an overview of the EU's political groupings, but what do you think? Should there be more of these groupings? Are the entry requirements high enough, or are they unfairly excluding smaller groupings? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram for more TLDR content. You can follow just the TLDR EU socials, or go wild and follow whichever TLDR accounts interest you. Anyway, following and sharing our posts not only gets you more from us, but it also really helps us out a lot, so thanks. And of course, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified whenever we post a video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, you too can back us on Patreon. The link's down below.